Hey everybody, and welcome back to an F1 roundup brought to you by the Seedstream app. In today's video, we're going to cover off the major talking points from today's Belgian Grand Prix, a race that I thought was epic. I had the privilege of commentating on it for the BBC, something that I never take for granted, and it was epic because it had a number of storylines playing out all the way through the race, and actually, as it turned out, even into the hours that followed the Grand Prix. So we'll talk about all of those things. The dominant win from Mercedes. We'll talk about the dire situation that is Sergio Perez's career and the wider prospects at Red Bull Racing in terms of their driver lineup moving forward and prospects for the likes of Max Verstappen and co. We'll talk, of course, about McLaren and generally round up what has been a brilliant first half of the season as we head into the summer break. But first, quickly, let me tell you about Seedstream. Seedstream is an app that some friends and I created to be what we hope is the best Formula One content app out there at the moment. In the end, we hope it might even branch out into other sports and other areas. But right now, it's solely focused on Formula One. And like all of the cars in Formula One, as we head into this summer break, they're all bringing updates to the cars. They're bringing upgrades, trying to improve those cars all of the time. Seedstream is doing exactly the same. Constant updates and improvements based largely on your feedback. So if you give it a go and give it a try, which I hope you do via the link in the description or by searching Seedstream in any of your app stores, I hope you will find that it is an app that continues to evolve and improve, getting better and better as time goes on. Right. Let's talk about the Formula One Grand Prix today then. Let me get that shadow off my face. The Formula One Grand Prix in Belgium, epic racetrack, brilliant first half of the season coming to a close, last day of school vibes, but actually also a brilliant Grand Prix. If we take a look at Mercedes' situation first, they absolutely smashed it today on the racetrack itself. We'll come to the controversy and the disqualification of George Russell in a moment. But in the race itself, they absolutely nailed it. With Lewis Hamilton, he drove a brilliant race, got a great start and put himself in a really strong position, executed his strategy almost perfectly. From his point of view, he did everything right. I also think from his point of view, Mercedes did pretty much everything right as well. And it was always looking like Lewis Hamilton was going to be favourite to win this race until George Russell had the inspired idea to think about gambling on what was a crazy idea of a one-stop strategy. Nobody's pre-race simulations had put a one-stopper as anything near viable. It just didn't make any sense. And even as Mercedes were running those simulations during the race, as they always do, it had, by switching onto a one-stop strategy, it had George Russell finishing 5th. That's the best they thought they could do by going for the one-stop. But it was a gamble that George Russell thought was worth taking. He had a good feeling in the car. He was looking after his tyres well. He could see there was cloud cover coming over. The temperatures were dropping and he thought that might help him preserve those tyres. Of course, he had the benefit of clear air in front of him, which helps a lot in terms of tyre preservation too. And he executed what was a really difficult and tricky situation, what was a massive gamble. He executed it brilliantly to take what would have been a brilliant win and an unbelievable finish to the first part of the season for Mercedes with a 1-2. Nobody predicted that today, but tyre degradation was lower than expected. That allowed George to push that one stop all the way to the limit. It was difficult to overtake with a shorter DRS zone as well. All of these factors played into the one stop working out nicely. And of course, if you're Lewis Hamilton, you've got every right to feel a little bit disgruntled that having driven such a perfect race, executing the brilliant strategy that the team had placed for you, driving really, really well, doing everything pretty much perfectly, you still don't end up winning because your teammate gets put on a different strategy. And I can understand why Lewis Hamilton is upset with that. I can understand why he would be a little bit put out. However, it's not something that the team have suddenly stitched him up with. This was a George Russell driven decision to make the one-stop gamble. Lewis Hamilton could have also made that decision from inside the car. It wouldn't have made as much sense for Lewis, of course, because with George in the position he was in, it was easier to take that gamble than it would have been for Lewis, who was leading the race at the time. Either way, I thought Mercedes had a very, very good day, until the fact that they didn't have a good day, until the point when the car was disqualified from the Grand Prix post-race for being underweight. There is no excuse for this, and fair play to Mercedes, they're not trying to make any. Yes, Yes, George Russell didn't have the benefit of a cool down lap, and so he couldn't go and pick up extra bits of rubber from the tyre marbles, which they always do at the end of a Grand Prix. Yes, he was on heavily worn tyres as well. There was a little bit of weight lost in that, but the team have to factor all of these things in. The fact that there's no cool down lap was no surprise. That's always the case in Belgium, so the team know that, so they can't rely on those tyre marbles to make the car reach the minimum weight limit. It's always just one of those things that's a bit of a belt and braces. You tell your driver to go and pick up rubber on the cool down lap just in case you happen to end up being marginal. In the end, Mercedes just got this wrong today. It was an oversight. It was a big one because that was a massive result for them. And unfortunately, they've missed out on both a huge amount of points, but also a real feel-good moment, a real boost for everybody in the team going into that summer break, proving once again that their car is coming back onto the right track in terms of development. They still have that, of course. They still have the idea that they are doing things well and they're progressing in the right direction, and it bodes well for the second half of the season. But a real shame for George Russell, of course, because it was nothing that he did wrong, but a real shame for the team in general that they weren't able to take those maximum points that they were really after today. So that was Mercedes. If we go further back to, let's look at McLaren, because Oscar Piastri, I thought, drove a pretty decent race. A little bit of an off earlier on where he stepped into the gravel, but nothing too major. A little bit of an oversight in his pit stop where he came in hot and nearly wiped out the front jack man. And I can tell you, having been in that situation, it's terrifying. But the team handled it well. They practiced for those pit stop failures, and they shuffled along, and it cost him a couple of seconds. But given the circumstances, the team actually dealt with it very, very well. I don't think that would have necessarily changed his race result. The one thing that could have changed his race result, and this is only with the benefit of hindsight, is this idea of going on to the one-stop strategy that George Russell executed so well. But as we said earlier, it was a difficult thing for someone like Oscar Piastri to do because it didn't seem to make any sense. It's also what makes that decision from George Russell, or the idea from George Russell, so brilliant, because it didn't make any sense, and yet he still made it work. But Oscar Piastri, a good result when he needed a good result, because having won the race last time out, there was always going to be a question mark or two about whether he only won it because Lando was told to move over and give him the place back at the end of the Grand Prix. I don't think that's fair. I think he deserved the win. I think he drove excellently last time out in the Hungaroring. But there's going to be this little asterisk in the back of his mind, I suspect, and perhaps the minds of other people too. Always will be there, but today he had to get his elbows out and he had to beat his teammate, and he did that fair and square. Lando Norris could not match the pace of Oscar Piastri today after what was another difficult opening lap, wasn't it, for Lando? Made a mistake, and it seemed like an unpressurized, almost a loss of concentration or a little bit of disorientation of where he was on the racetrack, but he got the start a little bit wrong, and that massively compromised his race today. In general, McLaren are actually doing very, very well right now, and I think going into this summer break, of all of the teams in the top half of the field, I suspect McLaren will be the ones going into the summer break happiest. Now, I know they didn't execute a brilliant day today, no, certainly not if you compare it to the on-track antics of Mercedes, but actually in the big picture, they're on this great development path, both in terms of the technical development of the car, but also of the organisation, where everything seems to be just working. The updates that they're bringing are bringing performance. Everything seems to be tuned and working very well at McLaren, and it bodes well not just for the rest of this season, but going into next year as well, and perhaps even beyond, because an organisation that's in a good place will tend to do very well whatever the challenges are that are thrown at them. We've got a very stable set of regulations now with massive changes coming in 26, but a good solid organisation is much more likely to do a good job when those big changes come as well. So I think McLaren can be very, very happy with the first half of their season's progress, I would say. Lando Norris beating himself up, as he often does at the end of a Grand Prix, being pretty hard on himself. But the reality is he does need, as the team have having to do as well, he does need to learn to just iron out the small mistakes, and they are small ones. Today, that little mistake at the beginning of the race cost him heavily because it put him back into traffic. And in today's race, running in the dirty air of cars around was just so compromising. He had no way really of getting out of that and moving forward. So that little error, that small mistake, really did cost him large. And he's got to find a way to stop making those. Of course he has, and he knows it, and he'll be very, very hard on himself until he gets that right. But maybe a break is exactly what he needs right now. Let's talk about Ferrari very quickly, because Ferrari I thought were disappointing. I know Charles Leclerc had a very good qualifying, found himself into 4th place, promoted then to 3rd at the end of the day, but really they didn't have the pace. They're the 4th quickest team of the top 4 teams in this sort of championship this season. And that's a big swing, isn't it? Because you go back a few races where they were dominating in Monaco, where they were looking really good in the early part of the season. They've now been left behind by the likes of Mercedes and, of course, McLaren as well. So they've got work to do. And I think in fact, they are the team in this top 4 with the most work to do, but also potentially the most potential in front of them if they can get that work right. Let's talk about Red Bull. Because at Red Bull, it's a bit of a mess, I think, to some extent. And I hope I'm not over-exaggerating that. But if we start with Verstappen, Verstappen's not in a mess. He's got a comfortable championship lead, of course, and I fully suspect that as the races roll on for the rest of this year, he should be able to quite easily execute a number of decent races and maintain that championship lead and become world champion at the end of it. So that's not too much of a mess, is it? But if we think about the bigger picture of Red Bull and Max's career, he's now in a Red Bull car that has been outdeveloped by some of those cars around them. Definitely McLaren, at times as well Mercedes, and as I said before, Mercedes are on this trajectory now, this pathway which they've unlocked of greater performance. That will only continue, to keep delivering performance if they keep down that same path. They've got potential in front of them. Red Bull don't have quite that same level of potential. And actually, if you think about the way that Red Bull are operating right now, it's not quite perfect, is it? Which is what we've been able to say about them for the last few years. They've got a car that's being outperformed and outdeveloped at times. They've got a second driver in Sergio Perez who is just not delivering anywhere near what he needs to deliver, and I'll pick up on that in a moment. And they have got an organisation in the background that's in turmoil. Make no mistake, it's a bit of a mess at Red Bull. And the more and more I think about it, if you look across the pit lane from Red Bull and you're looking down towards Mercedes, and I know that they had a good day today, at least in their on-track performance, if you're Max Verstappen, the more and more I think about it, this idea of an early move in 2025 to Mercedes to take Lewis Hamilton's vacant seat is looking more and more likely, possibly, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but more and more tempting if you're a Max Verstappen. Because are Red Bull going to be able to match the likes of Mercedes? Maybe next year, maybe not. But in 26, I don't think anyone's got too much confidence in this new Red Bull engine. Whereas the Mercedes engine, I think people do tend to have some confidence in. Now that may be misplaced because until we actually see an engine and see the performance of it, no one really knows. But they have at least got experience of delivering really strong results on the power unit front at Mercedes, which Red Bull just don't have. They have got this management or power struggle going on in the background. It's not the happiest place to be right now. And if you're Max Verstappen, you know, I could say the same about Lewis Hamilton. You could argue that Lewis Hamilton might be now looking at his move to Ferrari and saying, well, actually, the Mercedes is coming good. The Mercedes could end up being one of the real class leading cars by the end of this season, perhaps even, certainly going into next year. That could be a real tempting option for Max Verstappen. So keep an eye on it. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the more and more I think about it, there are more and more reasons that if I were Max Verstappen, I'd strongly consider it. On the other side of the Red Bull garage, we've got Sergio Perez. Now, Sergio Perez, oh, it's difficult, isn't it? I feel so sorry for him because his performance is just nowhere near where it needs to be. And that's the truth of it. Let me just change hands. That's the truth of it. Today, in today's race, he did a really good job yesterday in qualifying. In today's race, he had the ability to win a Grand Prix. He could have become the 8th Grand Prix winner in this brilliant season of Formula One that we're having. He's the only man out of the top 8 drivers from the top 4 teams not to have won a race yet, and this was his shot. And yet he fumbled it. And he had a very quick car. He was on the front row of the grid alongside Charles Leclerc in a Ferrari that wasn't anywhere near the pace of the field today. And if he'd got past him at the start, he could have controlled that Grand Prix with that clear air that was so valuable as we heard so many drivers say, and pulled out a lead in a car that was very, very fast around this circuit. As it happened, he lost places at the start. He just didn't have the pace, and once he got into that traffic, found it very difficult. And then his race was compromised by strategy because he had to move out of the way and be pitted early to move out of the way for Max Verstappen. But of course, that came about because he'd sort of fluffed the start of the race and hadn't been able to deliver on the promising performance that they had all hoped that he would be able to do. Where's my other dog? Wilson! Here he is. What are you eating? Oh, God. Come on. So the upshot of all of that is that Sergio Perez, having started on the front row, was only able to finish really just inside the top 10, and that is not good enough. And the reason that I'm talking about this now, this way boys, the reason I'm saying this now is that this was a really big moment for Sergio Perez. I'm not sure he could have done anything today that really would have changed the major opinions of those at Red Bull. But let's say he had gone on to win the Grand Prix, it then becomes a harder decision to replace him at Red Bull when you've just got a Grand Prix winner on your hands. But he didn't do that. And for me now, it's a no-brainer. If you're Red Bull, you have to replace Sergio Perez. And I say that with a sort of a heavy heart because he's a lovely guy. He's actually had a really long and solid career in Formula One, done some great things. I don't want to see this be the last contribution to Red Bull that he makes, maybe even to Formula One. But if you're Red Bull, you've got a McLaren coming very quickly at you in the championship. The points gap is now come down even more today, and they are in threat, serious threat, of losing the Constructors' title, potentially even coming under some pressure in the Drivers' World Championship. Because Sergio Perez is not just there to pick up Constructors' points, he's also there to stop the likes of Lando Norris and McLaren from taking points off Red Bull. If he's there backing up the first driver in Verstappen, the team is in a far better place, but also both titles become much more of a reality. I think you've got to put Daniel Ricciardo in the Red Bull. I think you've got to then either drop Sergio Perez down to the RB team if you want to do that, or you bring in Liam Lawson to replace him and Sergio has to sit on the sidelines. All of those options are possibilities, genuine possibilities, and we expect there to be some big talks at Red Bull, maybe even as early as tomorrow, and we might hear about a decision being made very quickly after that. It's been a brilliant, I think, first half of the season with lots of drama on track and off track as well. None of that is going to stop. We are heading towards a development war, which not only carries weight in this season, the development that teams are bringing to their cars is not just about this championship, because it carries over, of course, into next year's championship as well. There are so many things that are still up in the air and unknown, so many unpredictabilities about this year. I just think it's brilliant. We're going into a summer break now where we could well see driver changes. Those that I've talked about at Red Bull and RB, possibly even Logan Sargent at Williams being shown the door before the end of the season as well, perhaps even opening the door to a Kimi Antonelli to see how he might fare in the Williams car for the second half of this season. Valuable information for Mercedes if indeed they don't end up finding a way to get Verstappen into the car for next year. Lots and lots to be excited about in 2024 of Formula One. I hope you're enjoying it. Please, if you want to go and get the Seedstream app, it's totally free, and across the summer break you will get updates, but you'll also get all of the breaking news stories on any of the topics that I have talked about. Just follow the link in the description of this video or search Seedstream in your app store. Have a wonderful summer break, whatever it is you're up to, and in a couple of weeks' time, just a few, it's not too long, is it? We'll all be back talking about the next instalment of what I think is a season that will go down in history as being one of the best.